It's 11 o'clock, so we'll get started. Thank you folks for tuning in, and I'm going to turn it over to Oni, who's going to start us off. So Oni, take it away.
Thank you, Alana. Good morning, everyone. And thank you all for being with us today. And welcome to this special webinar on the critical role of the media in making sure our communities in New Jersey get counted. My name is Oni Advincula. I am the project manager for the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University. And through partnerships and collaborations, among many others, the center aims to strengthen local journalism and serve New Jersey communities. Since January, as part of the 2020 Census New Jersey Media Count Initiative, the center has implemented a reporting fellowship project on the census with New Jersey's ethnic and community media. And some of you here have been a part of that project to inform and engage specific populations most at risk of being undercounted. That is one project where we closely work with Advocates for Children of New Jersey, the main organizer of today's webinar. To introduce Advocates for Children of New Jersey works with local, state, and federal leaders to identify and implement changes that will benefit New Jersey's children. AC&J's work ensures that we have better laws and policies and more effective funding and stronger services for children and families. Over the last 2 years, AC&J has been working on promoting the 2020 census in order to ensure that all of New Jersey's residents, even the youngest children, get their fair share of resources. AC&J coordinates the New Jersey nonprofit outreach effort for the 2020 census and works with partners throughout the state to promote a complete count. So without much further ado, I will hand it over now to our main presenter.
So thank you, Oni, for that introduction. And I'd like to thank you, along with the Center for Cooperative Media, for helping us to coordinate today's webinar and for working with us and the Census 2020 New Jersey Nonprofit Coalition to spread messages about the importance of the census. We're really excited to be able to go over some of the reasons why it's so crucial to bring awareness to the 2020 census, and in particular to highlight the importance of the media in spreading messages about this issue. So Oni had started going over who AC&J is, but I'd like to reiterate, we are a statewide nonprofit child advocacy organization, and we're working towards improving the well-being of children for more than 40 years. My name is Alana Vega. I'm the Kids Count Coordinator at AC&J, so I'm responsible for putting together our annual Kids Count reports, which are data reports that track the well-being of children across the state at a number of different levels of geography. But beyond our Kids Count work, AC&J also focuses on a wide array of issues ranging from early childhood education to child welfare to juvenile justice and many more. And some folks may be wondering, how exactly did we get involved with the census? What's our sort of stake in the census? And we really became involved in this work besides our Kids Count work, which utilizes a ton of census data to put out our annual reports. We also became involved in this work because of the research that had emerged showing that young children under the age of 5 were the most undercounted age group. And then since then, we've become even more involved in the census work. And as Oni mentioned, AC&J is coordinating the statewide nonprofit outreach for the 2020 census in New Jersey. So to give you an overview of what we'll be covering today, first off, we'll go over as members of the media why you play such a critical role in promoting the census. Then we'll cover some of the basics of a census count, followed by some updates to the operational timeline around Census 2020, especially in light of the current pandemic. And then we'll also discuss some challenges to the count and go over some current response rates that have been put out. And then we'll have an opportunity for folks to ask questions. I do want to say, if anyone has questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and we'll sort of flag them. And then at the end of the webinar, there will be a chance for us to discuss them further. So to go over some top line general facts about the census that everyone should remember, the quick sort of elevator pitch about the census is that it's easy, it's safe, and it's important. And we want to also stress that it is here. Folks can actively complete their census at 2020census.gov. The self-response period actually began back in March. So March 12th was the start date when folks could start responding. Invitations were mailed to most households in New Jersey, and they had the option to respond either online, over the phone, or by mail. The census is available in multiple different languages. The online and phone options do have a more robust set of languages available, whereas the paper form, unfortunately, is only available in English or in Spanish. And we'll talk a bit more about the different options. So the reason we're hosting this webinar is really to emphasize the importance of the role that the media has in lead up to this census self-response operation. Many organizations had planned extensive in-person outreach strategies. And understandably, many of these events have been canceled or postponed due to the current pandemic. Since then, organizations have really transitioned to digital outreach strategies. You may have seen some of these on April 1st, which was Census Day. Many groups hosted different live streams, Twitter chats, etc. And these are all really great options that we as nonprofits have had to transition to. But we do have concerns that these sort of digital outreach strategies will be missing many of the hardest to count populations. They're not necessarily a substitute for in-person connections and in-person outreach. And so, as folks who are members of the media, you can help bridge the digital divide. Many households are sort of clued into their media outlets. They're looking for updates, particularly when it comes to COVID-19. And so we're hoping that this is an opportunity where we can message more about the census and talk about that this is something that folks can do while they are at home and practicing social distancing. So some things that are going to be occurring over the next week or so that I'd like to cover. On Monday, our Secretary of State, Tahisha Wei, kicked off the state's a new social media campaign. Each week there will be a focus on a different theme. And this week, which began April 20th, was focused on healthcare. So you can visit the New Jersey Department of State's social media pages to learn more about this effort, and you can check their Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages for that. Next week, the Census Bureau, will be kicking off their own social media campaign, which will be from May 1st to May 3rd. It's a weekend-long campaign. If you'd like to learn more, you can reach out to this email address and be added to the Census Bureau's media list if you're not already on there, so you can get the most current updates. And a bit of housekeeping, we are recording this webinar, and we will circulate with folks who have registered to attend, and we can share the slides as well for those who are interested. So some important things that I want to reiterate in terms of messages about the census. One, like I said, this is something that can be practiced from the comfort of your own home. It should take no more than 10 minutes, and it can be completed in one of three ways, all of which can be done through social distancing. They can be done online, over the phone, or by mail. A second point that's really important to reiterate is that the census is protected by federal law. Census workers do swear a lifetime oath that prohibits them from sharing your personally identifiable information for 72 years. And violation of this sworn oath could result in up to a $250,000 fine and/or 5 years imprisonment. So it's really something that's important to stress. And the Bureau actually has a really great fact sheet available on their website in multiple different languages about some of the confidentiality and security protections that exist. A third point, and one that we'll be talking about quite a bit today, is the census is really critical, and we're experiencing a real-time example of why the census is so important. It's really crucial to have accurate, solid data to make reliable public health predictions, and we're hearing a lot of those these days, and all of them rely on census data. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing that I want to stress is that we need accurate census data to allocate funding for important safety net programs. Programs like TANF, SNAP, school meals, all of these things rely on census data to accurately allocate their funding. And we know that many families are increasingly relying on these safety net programs as we experience this current economic downturn. Beyond that, there are many programs that are related to health, such as Medicaid, Medicare, the Children's Health Insurance Program, that all rely on census data to allocate funds. So again, right now, this is a really critical time and a reminder as to why the census is so important. So I said we would be talking more about why the census is so important. Many of you know what the census is. It's a count of everyone in the United States, regardless of their citizenship status, regardless of their age or their voting rights. But many folks don't necessarily know why the census is so important. I had mentioned that it's important for allocating funding, and it's estimated that in fiscal year 2017, $45 billion came into New Jersey thanks to programs that rely on census data to allocate their funding. So huge scale right there. Another reason why census data are so important is that they're used to determine our governmental representation in Congress, as well as the number of votes we have in the Electoral College, and they're also used to draw our voting districts. So census data also determine our political power. And another reason why the census data is so important, I had mentioned its usefulness in making public health predictions, but census data are also important for planning purposes. We need to know where populations are growing so that we can make sure that we have enough school classrooms and enough highways to sustain the population. So some basics about the census. You can see here that the census will only ask the basics. Please note that citizenship question is not amongst these items. So the Bureau will only be asking about your name, age, gender, race. For every person in the household, they will also ask for the relationship of the person completing the form to other folks in the household, and also whether you own or rent your own home. Just the basics, and it should be something that can be done in 10 minutes or less. As equally important as what the census will ask, it's good to go over what the Bureau will not ask on the decennial census. The Census Bureau will never ask for your personal financial information, donations, social security numbers, and they'll never ask for anything on behalf of a political party. So if you receive something that has any of those items, that's a red flag that this is most likely not the Census Bureau and is probably a scam. And so you should always proceed with caution. If you have any questions, you can certainly contact the Bureau to verify whether something is or is not legitimate. And this is something that is really good to message to folks. The Bureau has a great website at 2020census.gov. They have a whole page dedicated to rumors and scams that folks can look at to get a sense of what the Bureau will and won't be asking. It's quite clear. So it goes without saying that language support is something that is going to be really crucial with this census, as many New Jersey residents do not speak English. And so there will be online and phone support in 12 major non-English languages, as I had said earlier. Of course, these aren't all of the languages that are spoken in New Jersey. The Bureau does have these additional language assistance resources called language guides. They're available in print, so they can be downloaded off the computer. They're also available on YouTube in video format. And it's essentially a question by question screenshot of the English version of the questionnaire, and then translations into 59 other languages. So much more diverse array of options there. Of course, it's not quite the same as having the actual platform translated into each of those 59 languages, but it is a resource that we have from the Census Bureau. And unfortunately, the paper form is only available in English or Spanish. So I just want to remind folks, and this is something that we get a lot of questions, and honestly, most of the questions we get about the census really stem from this issue, which is, who do I count? Do I count this person? Should I not count this person? The general rule of thumb is that folks should be counted where they usually reside. If that is something that is difficult to ascertain, then it's where you live or where you lay your head to go to sleep on April 1st, 2020. Of course, we are now at April 22nd, so it does get harder for folks to necessarily, especially for folks who are really transient, to recall where they were on April 1st, 2020, but that's the reference point if folks' residence criteria is constantly shifting. One thing I do want to note, for young children, newborns should be counted in the census, even if they're still in the hospital on April 1st. Again, the reference point is babies born on April 1st or before should be counted. After April 1st, they should not be included on census responses. So I had mentioned that we would talk about some updates that have occurred in light of COVID-19. The Census Bureau has had to adjust some of its scheduled activities, and many operations have been extended or postponed, particularly those that involve Census Bureau staff going out into the field and interacting with folks. Currently, local area offices are expected to reopen on June 1st, although what that will look like remains to be seen, and I think it will be sort of a play it by ear, but that is the projected date. Non-response follow-up, which is the door knocking period, has now been moved to August 11th. Some folks may recall that it was supposed to start in May, but because of the current pandemic, census enumerators are not necessarily able to follow up in the field with folks door to door. This is an operation where people go out into the field, they knock on doors, and they count those individuals who have not yet responded during the self-response period. Special circumstances that I want to flag. There may be some confusion as to how to count college students in light of COVID-19. The Bureau has messaged this to universities, but it's important to reiterate. The general rule is that students who typically would be living at school should be counted at school. Now, if they reside in on-campus housing, the university is responsible for counting that college student. If they live in off-campus housing, they themselves are responsible for submitting their own census response. And in an ideal world, they would be coordinating with their roommates, if they have any, to complete that response, but we do recognize that that may be easier said than done. So college students can respond by using the invitation that they receive. If they're not at their off-campus address, they can use the non-response ID option, which means they will use their address, their off-campus address, to go into the portal and submit their response. One thing that is a positive is that the mailings for the census started before many folks started to be quarantined. And so like I have been saying, that this is something that folks can do from home. Mailers had started going out back in March 12th. And I do want to mention that beginning April 8th, the Census Bureau started sending out paper questionnaires to all households, all addresses. So initially, when folks received that mailing back in March, not all households received a paper questionnaire, only some did. Over the next few weeks, all households will be receiving that paper questionnaire. So if folks haven't received it yet, they should continue to look in their mailboxes through the end of April. And then into May, the Bureau is going to send one additional reminder postcard to households that have not yet responded. So there are going to be additional communications from the Bureau. Another option, the reason we're really highlighting the paper option is because we do recognize that many communities are not comfortable completing their questionnaire online. And so we want to lift up the paper form as an option for folks that is now going to be available on a wider scale. And I do also want to remind people about the phone lines. Those are an option. Previously, the Bureau had been experiencing some long wait times when folks would call in, particularly for specific languages. We had heard reports that some of the Asian language phone assistance lines were experiencing long wait times. That has changed as the Bureau has found a workaround and been able to shift more staff to these phone assistance lines. And so hopefully those wait times should be reduced for many people. We do recognize that though the paper form is an option that more people are comfortable with, it does have its language limitations by only being available in English or in Spanish. So we've been talking about some of the challenges when it comes to counting folks in the 2020 census, and you may have heard the term hard to count. So I'd like to discuss what exactly that means, and then I'd also like to look at some of the response rates and where we stand. So a hard to count population is a technical term. This was something that it was really used as a metric to identify areas that might need a bit more assistance when it comes to census outreach, that might be at a greater risk of being missed in the 2020 census. And hard to count looks at areas that have that had low responses to the 2010 census, specifically areas where a low percentage of individuals mailed back their 2010 census, because that was our only option back in 2010, was to mail our responses. So it's not a perfect science, right? There are some areas that have changed quite a bit since 2010, and so perhaps looking at 2010 response rates isn't 100% accurate, but it's a useful tool in identifying areas that, again, might be at a greater risk of an undercount. And some populations that historically have been difficult to enumerate for the purposes of the census are young children, people of color, immigrants, individuals who are highly mobile, renters. There are many different groups that are considered hard to count, and oftentimes they're overlapping. So why exactly, or how do people get missed by the census? The reasons can be complicated, and sometimes they are overlapping. Um, Two big reasons: language barriers, which we've been discussing a bit, also fear and mistrust of the government. And these first two are really more or less self-explanatory. But another reason why many folks are missed is because they might live in what's called a complex household, which basically means that they live in a household that doesn't look like a nuclear family. So examples of complex households include um, multi-generational households, households that have multiple unrelated families living within them. These are all complex situations. Another reason why folks may not be counted in the census is because their address isn't officially listed. So think of a household that might have an unregistered basement apartment. Technically, that basement apartment doesn't exist for purposes of the municipality, and so they may never receive an actual mailer addressed to that specific unit. So that's an instance where someone might be missed. And then lastly, another reason that folks are missed is because they are left off responses entirely. And this is actually something that is most applicable to young children. Um, and it's related to some of the previous reasons, such as complex households, why folks are left off responses. So here you can see New Jersey's current response rate in comparison to the nation. This is as of April 20th, which was the most recent data. The Bureau will update their data probably around 3 p.m. today. That's typically when we get updated response rates. So you can see here we're at 52.4% for self-response. New Jersey, we are above the nation, but again, we have room to improve. In 2010, our self-response rate was just below 68%. And of course, we'd like to be above 68%, but we're still below that currently. So there are some concerning trends that we are seeing nationally. One thing that I want to flag is that day-to-day increases in self-response rates are really shrinking. So in the initial period of self-response, we saw a lot of growth from one day to the next when it came to response rates. And just for context, nationally, during the first week of self-response, growth was 1.5 percentage points per day. Over the last week of self-response, the entirety of the week, we saw a 2 percentage point growth. So we went from 1.5 percentage points a day to just 2 percentage points over an entire week. So we are slowing down. We're seeing a bit of a plateau. We did see some growth after April 1st because there was a big push that it was Census Day, complete your census questionnaire, but we really haven't seen an increase like that. So we want to continue to talk to folks about Census Day has passed, but that doesn't mean you cannot still complete your census questionnaire, even though it is now April 22nd. And, to give you a sense of where New Jersey is nationally, after 4 weeks of self-response, we're really ranked in the middle of 50 states. As of the 20th, we were tied for 19th place with Massachusetts in terms of our response rate. And we are better than the nation. But to give you a sense, some context, the number one state for response rates is currently Minnesota, and their response rate is 60.9%. So we could be doing a lot better as a state. So some other concerning trends that we're seeing when it comes to particular communities, nationally, we are seeing that census tracts with high concentrations of Hispanics or Latinos or non-Hispanic Black populations do have some of the lowest response rates. And I'll show a bit more detail on that in the next slide. We are also seeing a big gap between what are called internet first and internet choice tracts. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier about folks' initial mailings from the Census Bureau. So some households received an invitation back in March to complete the census online or over the phone, and they did not receive a paper questionnaire. These are the internet first choice tracts. Internet first tracts did not receive a paper questionnaire initially. Internet choice tracts received instructions on how to complete the census online, over the phone, and they also received a paper questionnaire. So we're seeing a big difference in response rates between these two types of tracts. It's not a surprise, right? Because internet choice tracts in some ways were sort of identified as areas that might be less likely to respond, which is why that initial paper form was included in that first mailing. But nationally, there's a 9 percentage point difference in response rates between internet first and internet choice tracts after week 4 of self-response. So in addition to some trends that we have seen, we're seeing some other demographic trends amongst response rates. We're seeing a greater share of specific populations in the bottom 20% of self-response tracts. So these groups include folks who are renters, individuals who are limited English proficient, and then households without internet subscriptions. So here's a closer look at some response rate trends. This is from the City University of New York. They have put together their own hard to count map sort of tool, and they also release weekly response rate analyses. Every Friday they host a webinar that discusses some of their findings. The analysis is really great. It's an excellent summary of what's going on. So you can see here, CUNY took the bottom 20% of tracts in terms of their response rates and compared those response rates from March 20th to April 16th. And you can see some of the changes. What we see is that initially on March 20th, over half of the population in the bottom 20% were white non-Hispanics. As of April 16th, that had dropped to 33.4% of the bottom 20% of census tracts. Instead, what we're seeing is a higher concentration of non-Hispanic Blacks and also Hispanics and Latinos. So non-Hispanic Blacks were now 23.8% of bottom responding tracts, and Hispanics of any race were 33.9% of the bottom 20%. So something that we'll continue to monitor, and hopefully we can have a positive impact and sort of change some of these trends. So some resources for folks. I do want to say ACNJ, as we mentioned, is coordinating the nonprofit outreach effort for census, and we work with a number of different partners who represent different demographic groups, different geographic areas. We're happy to be a resource for folks on the call. If folks are looking for interviews, we at ACNJ are happy to do so and happy to make connections for individuals. Some other tools for folks, I had mentioned that we can now track response rates for different geographic levels, and the Census Bureau daily puts out those response rates on their 2020 census.gov website, and they're available at the state, county, city, and tract level. So if you focus on a specific city, you can drill down even further and look at specific areas of your city to see which areas might have lower response rates than others. And I had also mentioned City University of New York produces weekly analyses of national trends that can help you glean more information or insight on some of the response rates and how to interpret them. Another resource for folks is Census Bureau has put out a number of PSAs. They're on their YouTube page. They have an entire playlist. They're available in multiple different languages. I encourage folks to check them out, and they are something that folks can utilize. And lastly, I want to lift up some national nonprofit hotlines. Individuals who have questions about completing the census can use the Census Bureau's phone assistance lines. It's not just for completing the census over the phone. It is also available for folks who may have questions about different residence criteria. But I do recognize that many folks may not necessarily be comfortable asking some of these questions to a federal employee. And so some of our national partners have put together these phone lines that are available in several different languages. Partners like the National Association for Latino Elected Officials, also known as NALEO, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and 2 others that have set up these assistance phone lines if folks have questions about completing the census. So that is something to sort of publicize for folks as a resource. So I will end it there. That was sort of a rough summary of some of the top line messages and important information. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. We'll take this time to answer some of the questions you might have. And if you ever want to contact us, my name again is Alana Vega. You can reach me at avega@acnj.org. My colleague Peter Chen is also sitting in, and he has been actually leading the census effort at ACNJ, and so he's also available to answer any questions. So thank you, and we'll take some questions.
So one question came in from Marielle Natera, which was, even if people completed online or via phone, will they still receive the paper form regardless? I've had people ask me if receiving the paper form means that their online response wasn't valid or wasn't counted.
That's a good question. So typically, folks will receive follow-up mailings if they have not yet responded to the census. Now, of course, if I were to respond to it also depends on when you've received or when those mailings have gone out, right? So if I respond today and my paper questionnaire has already been sent in the mail, I'm going to get that mailing because the Bureau had already mailed my paper questionnaire before I self-responded online. So it's not necessarily an indication that your response was invalid for some reason, but typically, folks won't receive additional mailings if they've already responded.
Yeah, just to reiterate, it's the lag time on the mailing. So
Yeah.
for example, I filled out my census form the first day that it was available to do so, even before I ever got a paper mailing, and I still received 3 paper. I think it's just the lag time of the process, and the Census Bureau and the Postal Service are experiencing even more lag time than they historically have because of COVID-19. So just because someone receives a hard copy questionnaire in the mail does not mean that their response was not counted.
And I do want to mention, if you respond online, there is a confirmation page that pops up with a confirmation number. So it might be something helpful for folks who are completing it online to jot down that confirmation number just as a reference to have. But once you receive that confirmation number, that's typically an indication that it's gone through.
Okay. Debbie Duncan asks, if someone is in transition and temporarily renting an apartment and never received a census form, probably went to landlord, how can they be counted?
So for folks that didn't receive an invitation, you can go online at 2020census.gov or call and one of the phone numbers, and you can submit your response using the non-ID response option. So because you didn't receive your mailer, you didn't get that census ID code, and that's okay. You can use your current residential address to complete the census online or over the phone. You cannot use a PO box for this option. That's really crucial because this is about where you live or reside, and so PO boxes don't indicate that. So the Census Bureau needs that that residential address.
Right. So just to reiterate, anyone can fill out the census online or over the phone. They don't need to have the census ID number. They can fill it out at any point. And if they have questions, they can call any of the hotlines that were listed in the slides or also the Census Bureau directly. Next question is from David Spungen, who asks, what is the timetable for Congress to approve the new census timetable that the Bureau has asked for, which requested an extension through October 31st?
Peter.
So I can actually answer that. We don't know what the timeline is. So the Census Bureau has discretion to extend whatever timelines it has internally. The hard deadlines that are required by statute that has to be approved by Congress for a change, that's December 31st, 2020, which is the date at which the Census Bureau is supposed to produce apportionment counts for congressional reapportionment. That has to be done within 9 months of Census Reference Day, according to statute. And so you need a congressional action to change that. So technically they have until December 31st to make that change. Although obviously the Census Bureau would not have time to do the data processing that it needs to between the October 31st proposed extended deadline and December 31st. It's a long and arduous data processing that has to be completed, and it's going to be even more so because the extended window means people are going to move between April 1st and October 31st. So you're going to have a lot of duplicates. You're going to have a lot of weird data that'll have to be cleaned up. So to answer your question, sooner rather than later, but the hard deadline would not be until December 31st. Presumably Congress will act before then. There has not been a lot of conversation about opposition to moving the date, but they haven't done it yet.
One point of housekeeping, I know some folks are submitting questions into the chat. If you could put that in the Q&A function, I know it's a little confusing. It's easier for us to keep track of all the questions that are asked if you put it in the Q&A. So thank you.
Okay, next question. Orhan Akurt asks, why did some families not receive any form from the census? I got that kind of question a lot in my community.
So this goes back to some of the challenges in counting some folks. You know, sometimes folks' addresses may be new if it's a new construction. The Bureau works hard to update its list of addresses, but that might be an issue. Another might be that some folks are in unregistered apartments, or you know, one thing to consider is we know that many families are doubled up or tripled up in certain living situations, and you know, someone in your household may have received a form and completed it just for their individual family unit and not for everyone living there. So there are lots of different situations that folks might not receive a mailer, but you can still self-respond by going onto the Bureau's website or calling. Like Peter had mentioned, you don't need that ID code to respond.
Right, and I think that's part of the message we're sending to people is even if you didn't receive any mail from the census, you can fill it out. Even if you're not sure if you've been counted, fill it out. If somebody in your household may have filled it out already and you're not sure if they, just fill it out. Because at the end of the day, the Census Bureau can go back through and they can clean up duplicates, right? But if you never responded in the first place, there's no way they could find you. Right. And additionally, if you have an address that's not in the Census Bureau's master file of addresses, that signals to them that their master file has errors. And that'll help clean up the data in future years to be like, oh, that's a residence where people live. So there, you know, I think this is something we run into frequently, particularly in immigrant communities, particularly in areas where there are lots of multifamily or apartment units, which is unstable mail service. And we've heard that from immigrant rights groups routinely, which is don't mail us stuff, right? Send it to a PO box or send it to a different address because there's not reliable mail service at home. And that's fundamentally, the census is a postal-based survey. So if people have not received things, the original question, they can fill it out. Okay, next question, which is kind of interesting, is Kishu asks, what do you see as the factors that make Minnesota's response rate the highest? So I can actually take this one because it's something I looked into. So the upper Midwest has really high response rates if you look at the response rate map. So the top 5 states right now, I think, are Minnesota, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Iowa, and Michigan. And so there are a few reasons why this is. Remember when Alana talked about hard to count populations? You know, people of color, people who are renting their homes, low income residents, people who live in multifamily housing. Well, it turns out the upper Midwest has low levels of all of those groups. In the Midwest, so a place like Minnesota has tons of single family housing. It doesn't have, you know, so the highest response rate are in the ring suburbs around Minneapolis, St. Paul. And it's had the higher census response rates for the last, you know, 3 censuses, largely for this reason, which is, you know, it demographically, it's not, demographically, it does not contain as many of the hard to count groups as other areas in the country. And again, when we talk about hard to count groups, it's not that they're magically like something about them essentially makes them hard to count. It's that the way that the Census Bureau conducts the census makes it difficult to catch them. So you'll see on the map the sort of the high response rates in the upper Midwest.
And one thing I do want to flag too, I mean, this isn't something that's so applicable to New Jersey, but for folks who are listening in, we're pretty fortunate because most people do get a mailed invitation for the census, but in some parts of the United States, the primary way that folks receive their invitation to respond to the census is by a hand-delivered packet from someone who works for the Census Bureau. And so all of those operations are currently suspended because of COVID-19. And if you look at this map that's currently up, you can see that, for instance, there are some states that are a darker shade of orange. And in some cases, those are states that have high percentages of update leave operations, which is that hand-delivered packet. And you'll note that Puerto Rico is a very deep shade of orange, because Puerto Rico is almost entirely update leave operation.
Great. And New Jersey has a limited number of update leave areas. But for those of you who cover these areas, like far northwest Sussex County and Hunterdon County, as far as southern Cumberland, Salem, and Atlantic counties, and then the area immediately surrounding Fort Dix, for whatever reason, is heavily update leave. So that's just something to keep in mind for coverage. Next question: did Congress approve the Census Bureau's request to extend the deadline to October 31st? So I kind of answered this already, but the Congress has not yet approved anything, but the Census Bureau had discretion to move all of its internal deadlines. The deadline they couldn't move was the December 31st deadline to have all the data ready. That's what requires congressional approval for extension, and that's what we still haven't heard back from. Okay, Keishu asked again an interesting question, which is, can you explain the 9% difference between the Internet First and Internet Choice? So Internet First's response rate is 9% higher than Internet Choice. So I think it's a good question, and we don't have a great answer for it. So if this data point comes in from CUNY's analysis, which Alana mentioned in the slide. And so there were basically two options for receiving the census. There was what's called Internet First, where you received a letter that gave you your code and directed you to fill out the form online or over the phone. And then only on the fourth mailing would you have received the paper questionnaire. The Internet Choice areas, these are areas that the Census Bureau determined because of low internet access or other characteristics of those census tracts, they would also send the paper questionnaire with the first mailing. And initially, there was relatively little gap between the Internet First and Internet Choice homes, but as the census has continued onwards, there's a pretty large gap has opened up in response rate between those two groups. So the Internet First homes have responded about 9 points higher than the Internet Choice homes. And so I think the general conclusion, though, is that the same demographics of those tracts that made them less likely to respond in the first place via the online option also made them less likely to respond overall, and that whatever conditions are on the ground that are creating the low response rate across the board are exacerbated in those communities by the same factors that we talked about with hard to count, whether it's internet access or whether it's other priorities that are taking precedence for families now. That seems to be the case. But again, that's speculative. We're not going to know until we get the whole, and the situation is changing regularly. I mean, that has changed already over time. So it's a great question, and I don't think we have great answers for it. Okay, Mohsin Zahir asks, could we found a breakdown of self-response on the basis of race or communities? So actually, Alana, it's great that you have this slide up, so you can talk a little bit about, because we can't answer that question directly, but we can have some, there's some analysis.
Right, so we have analysis on a national level, and you can see here I've put this is the larger table that CUNY put together, comparing the bottom 20% of tracts on March 20th to April 16th. And so you can see here the racial breakdown. It is there are a higher concentration of African-American, non-Hispanic respondents as of April 16th, and also Latinos. Now, for New Jersey, if you go to CUNY's page, there are some functionalities where you can look at tract level responses, and I think you can get the ACS demographics from CUNY's map. So that is something that's not available. If you go to the 2020 census response rate map, CUNY's hard to count maps does have a bit more functionality in looking at the actual demographics of those tracts.
Right. So what we have is tract level demographic data. So for example, we can say the response rate in a tract that in the past has been predominantly Hispanic or predominantly Black. But we can't say whether there's a Black response rate or a Hispanic response rate currently, simply because the Census Bureau, again, mails things out to homes, not to people. So they don't know the demographics of who they just sent the thing out to.
Right.
We only have the response rate based on the number of things that they send out and where they have been sent back from. So this is where the population characteristics of tracts can be helpful. So the bottom 20% of tracts in response rate are disproportionately more Black and Hispanic than the nation as a whole. And so you can see some of that in the overall response rate, but we don't have, unfortunately, a response rate for particular demographics.
Right, because the way that they're tracking response rates in some cases, right, if somebody mailed back a paper form, a paper questionnaire, the U.S. Postal Service is sort of marking that as a response, right? And so they're just tallying who's responded. They haven't necessarily analyzed the content of those responses to get that demographic information.
Okay, next question is from Raymond Tyler. He says, hi, I'm a fellow from the Center for Cooperative Media. Is there any tracking of number on seniors and seniors that happen to be African American? Again, it's the same answer, which is we can't track the responses themselves, but we can track whether there are specific areas that have high concentrations of Black residents and high concentrations of seniors, defined by having a householder who's age 65 or older. Now, again, that's not perfect. The person filling out the form may not be 65 years or older, but they may have a senior citizen living in the home. But that gives some idea of response rates. But again, even there, it's hard to do an overlap. So we know that in the bottom 20% of response rates, there's a 20% chance that the householder was over age 65, and there's a 23% chance of the householder of the tract being predominantly African American. But that's not necessarily, the population of those tracts, 23% of them are African American. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have a response rate for those populations. And again, that's just sort of the unfortunate nature of how the data shakes out, and that the way that response rate is calculated. One thing I do want to say is that I want to mention the CUNY Graduate Resource Studies Center and Stephen Romoleski, who's the guy who put together the 2020 Census Hard to Count Maps website. He's a great resource and is very responsive by email. So if you do have questions, if you're writing a story on the census, they're usually good for a quick quote. The one thing I will say is they are a little bit academic. So there's a certain amount of simplifying that might be necessary for general audience. But Stephen's very helpful, and we're happy to put folks in touch with him if they have questions. Okay, so there's a question from Orhan actually, which just came up yesterday, which is the Census Bureau receives emergency approval to conduct pandemic survey. So this is the Household Pulse Survey, and I'm actually going to link to the Census Bureau's press release there. So the Census Bureau has many surveys that are in the field at any time. So the jobs report that we get on a weekly basis, on a biweekly basis, that's a Census Bureau survey. So the Census Bureau could have hundreds of surveys out in the field at any given time. And now they have an experimental survey, which is going to be conducted via text message and email. And this survey is basically asking, how are folks coping with the coronavirus? So it's going to ask questions about how individuals are experiencing business curtailment and closures, stay-at-home orders, school closures, changes in the availability of consumer goods, etc. This is just sort of like a general household survey. But this is different from the decennial census. And we've raised some concerns that this is going to confuse people who may have already received their 2020 census, or who complete this survey and think, well, I did my census, so I don't have to do the other one. So this is a totally separate survey. This is called the Household Pulse Survey. And if you have additional questions about this survey, we really encourage you to direct them to the Census Bureau's Public Information Office, which is PIO@census.gov. so we don't actually have lots of information on this survey, but and again, this has been a little bit challenging for census advocates, because one thing that we've told people is that the Census Bureau will only be contacting you by mail and potentially over the phone to follow up for data quality reasons, or with an in-person enumeration. And so now that there's this text and email thing out there from the Census Bureau, we're concerned about some confusion. But the bottom line is, if you go to 2020census.gov, that is the place to fill out your decennial census form, or if you call the Census Bureau's number to fill out the census form online. So I understand that there's confusion there. We are a little bit confused. And if you have questions, feel free to direct them to the Census Bureau's public information. Okay, next question. Mohsin Zahir asks, can you explain a little bit more about children born after April 1st, and also counting of students not living in campuses, not living in college campuses or dorms?
Sure. So the rule of thumb, because the sort of reference point for the census is April 1, we count babies who are born on April 1st or before in census responses. That's the rule of thumb. That's the guidance. Even if that baby is still in the hospital on April 1st, they should still be counted in the census response. When it comes to college students, and this is something that's confusing to many people, typically college students who typically would be residing at school are counted at school. So if they live in a college dorm, so any sort of on-campus housing, the university itself is responsible for counting those students, and the Bureau works closely with colleges to administer that count. Sometimes it's through electronic records that the college provides, and that's how they get the count. Some schools opt to send out a paper questionnaire. It's a very short questionnaire to all of its college, to all college students who reside on campus, to get that information for the Census Bureau. It really varies from school to school, but as I understand it, in light of COVID, many schools had opted to use the electronic response rather than working out some sort of paper form option, because so many students weren't on campus and had returned to their parent or guardian's residence in light of COVID. For those college students that live off campus, that's trickier. So off-campus college students should be counted at their off-campus address, because that's where they live or sleep most of the time under normal circumstances. We recognize, though, that many students who typically reside off campus when school is in session have returned back to their parents' homes or their guardian's home, and they may not get that census mailer because they're not at their college address. And that's where that whole non-ID response option comes into play. So folks can still sign in to 2020census.gov and complete their census questionnaire for their off-campus address. And as we were saying, ideally they would work with their roommates, if they had several, to include all of their roommates on that response that they administer over the web. But if college students are unsure if their roommate, they're not able to get in touch with their roommates, or then you should try and just complete the questionnaire and include everyone who lives with you if you're a college student who typically lives off campus. Sorry, that was very it's confusing, but the Bureau put together a video that explains it far better than I do in a short amount of time, and I can find that and send that as a link to folks in the chat.
Yeah, and maybe we can include that in our follow-up email, which will include the and that is a question that's come up a couple times. Will there be the recording and the slides? We will definitely send that to all participants in today's webinar. And we'll send it to Oni to send out to the rest of the CCM network as well. So next question. How do you get your data for state self-response rate calculated versus the rate of specific cities? For example, I just finished a story on Paterson, New Jersey, and their number is far less than the state's number, as you just shared. So the Census Bureau has a website for response rates, which is linked in the PowerPoint, but which I can add in the chat window here. So this, whoops, sorry, I meant to send this to everybody. all panels and attendees. So this website, 2020census.gov/en/response-rates.html, this map allows you to look at individual municipalities. So on the right, you can select a state, and then but you'll see that for geographies, you can choose city or town and township. Now, confusingly for New Jersey, some cities that we consider cities are listed as town and township, some towns and townships are listed as cities. But the bottom line is you can usually find in one or two of the other category a particular municipality. So, the way that these rates are calculated is basically the Census Bureau sent out however many mailers, and they've got responses based on that mailer for whatever percentage that they sent out. So they calculate it by city or town or township, by tribal area, and also by individual census tract. So you can zoom all the way in. So you're correct that Patterson has a much lower response rate than the rest of the state. In fact, almost all of our hard to count areas have lower response rates than the rest of the state. That's, again, to be expected because they are hard to count. But that's how you can dig in and get that data. And if you have more questions or if you want a more hands-on explanation, feel free to reach out to Alana or me and we can give you a little tutorial on how to access this. There's also, as I mentioned, the CUNY website, which is Census 2020 hard to count maps.us. Sorry, no, I got that URL wrong. So I'm typing it into the chat window. So this provides a lot more data than what the Census Bureau's response rate page provides. It provides, I think, a lot better context for some of the demographic factors that may play into an area's response rate. And so I encourage you to check that out as well. If you just type in the top right any address or location, it'll immediately zoom you in there, and then you can choose whether you want to look at it by state, census tract, city, whatever. So just a plug for that as well. Okay, next question is from Clebiel Marcano. In 2010, New Jersey residents were not fully counted. How are organizations like you affected by the fact that the state was not fully counted? So Alana, you want to talk about that?
Sure. So, sorry, the question is gone. Can you? Peter?
Oh, sorry, I listed it as answered already. Let's put it back.
If you want to take a step. So,
yeah.
As kids. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So it says the question is, New Jersey residents were not fully counted. How do organizations like you, how were organizations you represent affected by the fact that the state was not fully counted?
Right. So I think one thing that had come up is, as kids count, I'll answer this as sort of my role as kids count coordinator, and as an organization that primarily serves organizations that serve children. We work with a number of early childhood providers. And so, I'm constantly getting folks asking, how many children under the age of 5 live in my particular area? And we know that children under the age of 5 were the most undercounted age group. And so when it comes to service allocation and trying to design programs for young children, it becomes really difficult for a childcare provider to make sure that they're reaching their universe of children under the age of 5 if the numbers we're working from aren't necessarily 100% accurate. And so that's something that we're really concerned about. But many of these children also live, children don't complete their own census questionnaires. They do live with parents or with guardians who complete them, right? So that also means oftentimes that their parents may not be counted. In some cases, that parent may have been counted. They just didn't count their young child. But, so this is something that really is critical for accurate data for planning purposes and just for assessing service delivery amongst nonprofits. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Peter.
No, I mean, I just say that the funding piece is the biggie on the sort of policy side, right? Like every program that you can think of that affects young children or families, whether it's SNAP or WIC or Medicaid or school meals, I mean, they're all fundamentally based on census counts. And, what the census counts affect is like the size of the overall pie or chunk of pie that New Jersey receives for a lot of these programs. And particularly because New Jersey's hard to count has these concentrated hard to count populations that may not be getting their fair share. Whereas when you look at a map of New Jersey, the wealthier suburban areas of New Jersey have higher response rates. That we may be losing out on federal funding. New Jersey is usually last or second to last in the nation in what we receive in federal funding compared to what we send to the feds in terms of tax base. And, we can't put a dollar amount on exactly what it meant for, New Jersey's young child undercount in 2010. But again, it affects the size of the pie. Oftentimes when we're talking about New Jersey budget issues, particularly with programs that affect young children, the dollar amounts that we're talking about are small in comparison to whatever, a 1 or 2% difference in federal funding. So I think that's the way that programs are affected. It comes down the line, right? It's not an immediate, oh, someone didn't fill out their census, I guess we're losing money. But it's those trickle-down effects from a census undercount that affect programs for a decade to come, right? Because we're still working with the 2010 counts right now. Okay, next question we can just answer quickly is, do you have any idea how many undocumented immigrants are living in New Jersey? As Alana mentioned, we don't know this from census data because the census does not collect information on immigration status. The decennial census does not collect any information on immigration or citizenship status, and even the American Community Survey does not collect information about whether someone is undocumented or not. It collects whether a person was born inside the United States, but there is not
it does,
estimates.
So ECS doesn't say whether or not someone's undocumented, but we do have, and there are numbers available for who is a citizen and who's not a citizen.
That's right.
But it doesn't get to that level of undocumented status. And because I was curious, I was able to quickly pull up the number of children who are estimated to be in immigrant families whose resident parents are not U.S. citizens in New Jersey, and it's about 245,000 children under the age of 18 in 2018. So that's about 32% of children.
Right, but that's not undocumented immigrant parents.
That's
and
just
so all the undocumented immigrant data that we have are based on statistical surveys that are independent of the Census Bureau. So that's just something important to keep in mind, particularly when we're talking about the response rates among populations that are concerned about immigration status, is that is not data that the Census Bureau has or collects. They do have citizenship status from ACS, but they don't have whether someone's documentation status. Okay, question from Raymond Tyler. Are census forms that are not completed counted partially or discarded? In other words, if a partially completed form is mailed back, is that counted?
So we don't know the exact threshold at which the Census Bureau considers something a completed census questionnaire. There is a point that say if someone were to complete their questionnaire and just fill out their name, the Bureau will not consider that a complete response. And that's typically when they would send an enumerator in person to follow up and get the full response from that household. So there is a point at which the census will not consider it a completed questionnaire. That's how they've implemented in the past.
Okay, last question from Colleen O'Day, and then we will close out. The question is just, do you suggest using the census map data or the hard to count map? Is one better than the other?
And then she followed up and said, never mind, you answered my question now. So
then there you go. I mean, we don't recommend one over the other. I think there are pros and cons of each. One thing I will say is that the Census Bureau's Tableau, which is on there, which I'll also send in the chat window, it has rankings, which, can be helpful or not. But I find that if I want to see every municipality in New Jersey in like a table format, this is the easiest way to pull it. And same thing if I want all the county data. But you can also see, comparisons between individual municipalities in a similar radius. So I think that's our answer there. Neither is better than the other. But there's more demographic context in the CUNY maps.
All right, so I think that's all of our questions. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Like we said, we will be sharing a recording of this webinar as well as the slides with everybody who registered, and we'll work to incorporate some of the links that we mentioned during this Q&A portion. Oni, I don't know if you'd like to close out with any messages to everyone, but thank you, and I'll turn it over to Oni.
I just want to say thank you very much. Yeah, this is very helpful.
I just want to make a quick plug for those of you who are members of the media who are, curious about how to do an angle on this story. I do think just if you're doing interviews for anything else, especially since it's all coronavirus all the time, it's worth it just to ask people what they've heard about the census, because the response rates are low, and if people are saying like I haven't heard about the census, or I thought that was already over, that's important information that's worth having, and I think that it can be the hook for a story, particularly for communities that have relatively low response rates. Thinking about your Patterson, your Newark, your Trenton, Atlantic City, and thinking about where there might be an angle there. So just a suggestion is just to ask the question about census, because it's often surprising how, for those of us who have been doing census advocacy since for the last 2 years, it feels like we've heard it all. But when we talk to individuals about it, they probably haven't heard very much about it. So just a suggestion as far as where there might be a hook for a story.
Great. Well, thanks, Peter, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate you taking the time, especially given the current situation that we're all in, to learn more about the census. And we really appreciate the work that everyone who signed up is doing. So thank you for your time. And if anything, you can always follow up with us via email if you have any additional questions.
Yeah, you know where to find us. Thanks.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.